Good evening all and welcome to an Oz Cyclone Chasers Cyclone video update tonight, the 2nd of March 2014. My name is Chris Nitzo. Firstly, I'd like to thank our followers. We've ticked over to 93,000 followers, so we've had around about a few hundred in the past day or so. So welcome to all our new followers, and we hope you stick with us with the upcoming cyclone potential over Queensland. Now tonight we're going to talk mostly about the Queensland system. We'll touch on briefly the WA system as well, because that is starting to show just the potential of forming into something more significant later next week and into next weekend. I will try to keep it as brief as possible, but I do warn you that the Queensland system is very complex and there are two likely scenarios that will eventuate from that system. So one of those two is likely to play out, and to explain both of those is going to take a little bit of time. So bear with me while we try to do that. But firstly, let's take a look at what's going on now and what's going on rainfall-wise over the next week. So firstly, as we take a look to WANT, we can see there's a very weak sort of cluster of storms here over the Joseph Bonaparte Gulf region. Now, there is some weakish rotation associated with those, and with it comes a very weak low pressure system. Now, that cluster of storms is expected to remain in and around that region or slowly push towards the west out here into a bit more open water over the next 3 to 5 days. Now at this stage conditions aren't overly conducive for development of that system, but over the course of the week to 2 week mark there is the signs and the likelihood that things will become more favourable as we head into later this week and into the weekend. Things may get more favourable for that to further form. Now, if we look further eastwards, we can see that that cluster of storms that I'm talking about is attached to a fairly deepish inland trough, and along that trough line we've got scattered thunderstorm activity, particularly over the Northern Territory, but also some isolated pockets of thunderstorm activity in the Western Queensland region. But mostly we've got just fairly drizzly type rain across Queensland. Now as we head further to the east, this is the area we're watching out here in the far northeast Coral Sea. You can just see the outskirts here of the circulation just in there, and we've got a fairly active convergence zone here, or a convergence line with thunderstorm activity popping up all over it. So what we've got today is the Bureau of Meteorology has analysed the low pressure system, what I believe to be quite correctly, out here near the Solomon Islands, but the JTWC has also positioned a weakish low that they're looking at much closer to Queensland out here off the southern tip of PNG. Now, that is more associated with a convergence zone or a convergence line rather than here where we can really see an area of rotation out here in the northeast. We can't really see that area of rotation as well here underneath this cluster of storms. So at this point in time, this looks like the area to watch for that low pressure development. But look folks, because it's so weak, don't be surprised if things get moved around over the next 24 to 48 hours as it consolidates. The next name on the cyclone list for whichever system develops, more than likely the Queensland one, will be called Gillian. So we're up to the G. We've just had Fletcher in the Gulf about 3 weeks ago. We are now up to Gillian, and the next one after that will be Haiti. So they're our next two names on the list. So if we look now to the Queensland system and look at it in a little bit more detail, a weak tropical low is located southwest of the Solomons. It's expected to move slowly west in the next few days. Now, what it does after those few days, though, is the key here, and there's two options, and it really has only those two options at this point in time. It is likely to either continue pushing west as a weak tropical low and cross the Cape York Peninsula region, or it is likely to stall just on or just off the coastline of Queensland and then push in a south to southeast direction parallel to the coastline. So they are the two options it is most likely to adopt at this point in time, according to pretty well all of the guidance that we have seen. So the issue, I guess, is, and the confusion arises as to which one of those options it takes, because they are vastly different in terms of outcomes. The one where it goes south to southeast parallel to the coast, or if it's close enough, even possibly nudging the coast the whole way through, That is the serious scenario, because that one could intensify, or the system could lie in a situation where it could intensify pretty rapidly as the weekend comes into, or sorry, the later part of this week and the weekend comes towards us. So the other option is, I guess, less serious, but it will offer probably a wider spread of rainfall. Not so much heavier rainfall, but a wider spread of rainfall across the far north and pushing even into the tropical coastline as well. So they're the two options, and let's take a look at which models are going for which option. So firstly, we're going to start with the European model, and the European model has been quite consistent the past two runs about what it does with this system. Now, this is the second option, so this is the southerly option, and the European is perhaps the most closely aggressive model in terms of impact on the Queensland coast. So let's take a look at the latest in the Euro model. This is tonight. We see the low pressure system exactly where it is. So it's initialized it pretty well. Doesn't do much with it as we head towards Monday night and into Tuesday morning. It just sort of drifts west here in the Solomon Sea and doesn't really push too far to the south. Now, as we head to Wednesday morning, though, it starts to adopt a south-southwesterly track or southwesterly track. And as we head to Wednesday night, we continue to see that track. It's fairly slow, though. It's a fairly slow process, and because of that slow process, we actually see that eventually, by the time it decides to start moving towards the coast, it starts to become captured by upper level northerlies and northwesterlies, and so that's why it doesn't push west into the peninsula like some of the other models do. Now, as we head to Thursday morning, we continue to see that track to the southwest. As we head to Thursday night, we continue to push this system a little bit further to the west. You can see it's starting to develop some pretty decent winds to the south here, 23 to 28 knots sustained winds there on the Thursday. Then as we head to Friday, we actually start to see gale force winds developing around the system in parts, although not enough to be a tropical cyclone. We continue to see that southwest track, but here on the Friday night, we start to see a more south-southwest track in the system, and we start to see an intensification of the winds to the south. Now, that's due to a pressure squeeze between the low, or the cyclone, and a big high down south in the Tasman, which you can't see on your screen right now, but that's what's causing such intense winds there. And then as we head towards Saturday morning, we see its close approach to the north tropical coast, but it's starting to push in a more south to southeast direction, so it'll start to approach the Herbert Lower Burdekin and the central coast, and with Sundays following on from that. So as we head towards Saturday night and Sunday morning, we see it become a tropical cyclone, possibly reaching to the stage where it's a fairly high-end Category 1, possibly even a low-end Category 2. And if we just zoom into this region here, so you've got some place names, we've got Townsville, Bowen, Mackay in that region of the system's approach. Now, that'll be quite interesting, especially if it adopts this sort of track, because on Saturday night, this is its approach on Saturday night. We can see here it's pretty close to Townsville. They're only about 100 or 200 kilometres off the coast, and in that situation, it'll be quite interesting because there's an NRL game on the Saturday night as well. So it'll be very interesting to see whether they cancel that or what will happen there, especially if this track is adopted. Now, bearing in mind that the ensemble track is a lot further to the east, and we'll talk a bit more about the ensemble stuff later, but we can see here as we head to Sunday into the week's range here, it just sort of sits right off the coast of Bowen, within sort of 20 kilometres of Bowen. So very, very intense winds smashing the coast to the south, and even some intense winds to the west of the system, unlike Dillon, which had only winds to the south. So a little bit of a different structure in this system according to the Euro. Now, what does that look like in terms of rain? Well, you don't need to be a genius to figure out that sort of scenario is going to cause a lot of rainfall. And so if we start to look at rain on day 3, we can see that all the rain is located well offshore. There's very little rain on the coast of Queensland. The flow is pretty dry overall, and the only time you're getting rain is in that isolated coastal strip that's more exposed. And same thing on day 4. As we head to day 5 though, we start to see the low pressure system develop. We start to see, particularly on that southwestern quadrant, some intense rain, but all of that remains offshore and we still have a fairly dry flow along the coast. So really folks, for the next 5 days there's very little rain associated with this system on the coastline. By day 6 it approaches the coast sufficiently to create a lot of rain in that rain band, but it's only once again hitting the exposed coastline, and most of the heavier stuff tends to be sort of Townsville south to Mackay, as opposed to the Cairns region. And then as we head to day 6, we actually see the system as it approaches the coast. We see some very intense rain here. This orange is 50 to 100 mils over 12 hours. So we're going to see some very intense rain over the Burdekin and the Central Coast and Whitsundays if the system adopts this southerly track. Now, not only will you see gale force winds, you'll see extreme rainfall amounts as well if this track is adopted. So this is scenario 1. Now, this isn't the only model that's adopting scenario 1. The UK Met model adopts a pretty similar track, although a lot further to the east. So this is the UK Met. At day 2, we can see the system on Tuesday morning located a little bit further to the east compared to the European model. And as we head to day 2.5, we see the system just tracking very, very slowly and not in any particular direction. As we head to day 3, we see the system tracking slowly to the west. And day 4, we start to see the system tracking more in a southerly direction. Now, I can tell you from the extended period, which I'm not allowed to show you on screen, but I can tell you in the extended period, that system from day 4, from the Thursday, continues to track pretty well due south. So it continues to track in a direction pretty well that way, and so it doesn't actually get too close to the coast. Now, if the UK Met model scenario pops up and actually happens as predicted, we're going to see possibly an intensification of the system, or probably an intensification of the system to Cat 2 or 3 intensity, and we're going to see the system remaining too far offshore to create any rain for anyone, except for the surfers. It's going to create a lot of waves in southeast Queensland, so that's something that the surfers, I'm sure, will enjoy. But overall for Queensland, it's not going to give much joy if it adopts that particular track. So that's the UK Met. The Euro, remember, pushes the system a lot closer to the coast, and obviously with that comes a lot of rain and a lot of wind. So even though they're about 500 or 600 kilometre difference in the track forecast there between these two models, the scenario and the steering level mechanisms are pretty similar from both models. The only difference between the UK and the Euro model is that the UK Met model makes this system stronger earlier. Now, because it becomes stronger earlier, the steering level flow associated with the system changes. And so let's have a look at the steering level flow in scenario 1. So here is, according to the Euro, on day 4 on Thursday, the system remains fairly weak and it's continuing to push in a westerly direction. Now, this is the mid-level steering flow at 700 hectopascals, so this is 3 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. We can see that overall the steering flow is either a south to southwest motion in this scenario. Now, if we compare that steering flow to the UK Met, which has a deeper system on day 4 and a rapidly intensifying system on day 4, we're going to see that the UK Met model scenario has a different steering level mechanism, and so therefore the system remains a lot further to the east than what the European suggests it will. So according to the Euro model, we should be seeing a net track of the system in that particular direction on Thursday, so still pushing towards the Queensland coast. Now, on Thursday, according to the UK Met model, we take a look at this upper level high, which is located right over the top of Fiji, or between Fiji and Vanuatu. Now, that seeks to make sure that anything on the western edge of that high that has a little bit of height to it, so a la a tropical cyclone, will push in a more southerly direction, being on the western edge. Now, remember, a high circulates winds like this. Okay, so if you've got a cyclone that is located, out here, it's going to push in that direction under the influence of that high to the east of it. Now, if you have a low that is not as deep as a cyclone and not as deep height-wise, you're not going to be steered by this flow at all, and so therefore you're going to push more towards the west or the southwest. And so that's the key fundamental difference, and to why the UK Met and the Euro diverge a little bit, even though they're showing a very similar steering pattern or a very similar steering flow. So this is the Euro upper levels and the UK Met upper levels are exactly the same, but the difference is the intensity of the system on days 4, 5 and 6 that results in a different trajectory of the system as it approaches the coast. So remembering, the European model pushes the system a little closer to the coast. The UK Met model keeps it too far offshore to give any meaningful weather to the coastline. Now, because fundamentally the European and the UK Met model have a very similar steering flow in the middle and upper levels pattern at that particular time, if we look now towards day 5, the European has a potentially much stronger system located in the central Coral Sea, and that can be shown by this shading here. You can see this shading much darker than the other shading, or brighter, sorry, than the other shading. That shows us that there's a high variability, or at least some of the model guidance predicting a very low pressure system in this region compared to most of the other guidance. So on the Euro that I showed you on day 5, we had a system tracking towards the coast, much closer to the coast in this region. So that was it there. Now, the European ensemble suggests that there's a fairly high error margin out to the east of that particular low pressure system. So therefore the European could be in slightly better agreement with the UK Met in terms of a more easterly solution as well. Look, it all depends on how much it intensifies over the next 4 days. If it intensifies too quickly, the system will track in a more southerly direction. If it doesn't intensify very rapidly at all, it'll push further to the west, and we'll talk about scenario 2 shortly. Then as we head towards day 6, we can see that area of variability being very large here, but especially the favoured region, or the favoured area for this low pressure system to lie, is probably just east of about 150 degrees on the Saturday, and probably just off the coast between Townsville and just north of Cairns, but still overall a fair way off the coast. Now bear in mind though that when we look at this maroon region here, we have a lot of error associated with it, and so therefore the system could be lying anywhere really inside that error margin. So just be aware that while this is the more favoured position for the low, it could still be lying a long way further to the west, in fact over the coastline by Saturday, or it could be lying a lot further to the east. Now bear in mind also that we have a very strong high pressure system being modelled here by computer models, and that's going to try and halt the southward progression of the system. So even though the upper levels will be trying to push it to the south, the surface level will be trying to push it to the west. So there's going to be a battle there. The resultant flow and the resultant track of the system is not going to be either west or probably either south. It's going to be somewhere in between those vectors. So therefore it's going to be a very complex situation there as the system continues to track further to the south and the ridge builds in the Tasman Sea. In fact, we could get to a situation where the lower cyclone becomes very, very slow moving, and in that situation, if it lies closer to the coast and very slow moving, we could be seeing a hell of a lot of rain from the system, particularly to the south, in this very, very strong convergent flow to the south of it. So, folks, it is a highly varied scenario out to day 6, and the big thing to note is this is scenario 1, and even in scenario 1 there's a lot of variability between the system being close to the coast, dumping copious amounts of rain and gale force winds, to the system being well offshore and dumping nothing but fine weather and blue skies on us. So it is already, even with one scenario, there's so much variability. Let's talk about scenario 2. Scenario 2 is shown by the GFS modelling, and the GFS modelling shows a very weak and raggedy low pressure region here in the Solomon Sea over the next couple of days. Now, as we head towards Tuesday night, the system really doesn't tighten up at all, and as we head towards Wednesday morning, it continues to be a very loose looking system, very weak and ugly looking tropical low. It really doesn't have much guts to it at all, and it's not until Wednesday night and into Thursday that it starts to produce what could be considered gale force winds around the circulation. Now, bearing in mind that GFS tightens it up unnaturally quickly on the Wednesday and Thursday into a tropical cyclone. So with that in mind, we can see that the system now lies a lot further to the west than, say, what the European was showing us. If we looked at the European at the same time, the Euro had it way out here, whereas the GFS has it way in closer to the Cape York Peninsula. So by that stage and that far to the west, we're not going to see the influence of that upper high over Fiji, and instead what we're going to see influencing this system is mid-level ridging. And so if we look at the 300 hectopascal winds in the area, we can see that they're all going east to west, so there's really very little doubt in the track of the system if it adopts this this GFS style of movement. So if the GFS comes out in this scenario, we see the system continuing to push west indefinitely and well and truly hitting the Cape York Peninsula towards the end of the week, more than likely around the Friday or Saturday mark, as we see here. And we'll continue to track this and go forward. We see it hitting Cape Melville on Saturday morning and then continues west into the Gulf of Carpentaria. So that is scenario 2, and that is also being shown by a couple of other models. The FIM model is also showing something similar. And thanks to Weather Zone for the weather graphics here, the Access G model from the Bureau of Meteorology is showing something quite similar as well. In fact, this is the Bureau's favoured scenario according to the state outlook or state forecast. We see the Bureau favouring this particular model scenario. Now, if this happens, remember, the good thing about this scenario is that while we don't get a cyclone to chase, the good thing for everyone else's perspective is we're going to see some very heavy rain on the North Tropical Coast and even getting as far down as the Central Coast and with Sundays. So with this scenario, we're going to see a very wet weekend across the north, despite the fact that it's only a low, and probably because of the fact that it's only a low, we're going to see feeder bands throughout that, throughout the southern section of that low. So you can see here some very heavy rain happening all through from about, or even just north of Rocky, in fact, all the way through to Cape Melville, where the cross point happened as the system continues to track through, and that rain continues in a fresh and moist easterly stream here on the coast of Queensland. So folks, for rainfall, that is a great scenario, and as I said though, it does not bode well for a tropical cyclone to form if that happens. It's going to be too far north, and unless it can sort of sit here for a little bit and develop, it's unlikely to have the outflow channel created by an amplifying upper level trough, which we haven't even talked about. That's how much we've had to focus on these other factors. We haven't even talked about an upper level trough that amplifies over Queensland on the weekend and what effect it'll have, because that's just so far away. So we're not even going to mention it too much more, other than to say that it is going to happen later in the weekend, and that will also bear, particularly in scenario 1, that'll bear a big and possibly determining factor in whether scenario 1 makes landfall, gets close to the coast, or pushes back out to the east. Alright folks, so there's our two scenarios. At this stage, it's a 50-50 bet either way. We just don't know. There's no credible guidance that is being at steady and secure for more than one run, or more than 2 runs, so we can't tell you which one is the most favoured scenario just yet. Look, midweek we should be able to have a very good idea at which one's going to come true, but at this stage we can't tell you either way. Alright, let's quickly have a look at the next 4 to 8 days of rainfall. So the next 4 days, WA, unfortunately, if you live anywhere south of about Broome, and even then, even around Broome, you're not going to see too much, but In WA, it's pretty well sky clear unless you live in the North Kimberley. Now, that tropical low or very, very weak thunderstorm cluster in the Joseph Bonaparte Gulf, Southern Timor Sea, is likely to be quite slow moving, but slowly moving to the west. And so we're going to see some fairly decent rainfall over there over the next 4 days. We're going to see some pretty good shower and storm activity through inland parts of Northern Territory. We're still seeing that. We saw that on the satellite image at the start of this broadcast. We're going to see some good shower and storm activity on the northwestern Cape and also over the Torres Strait as well. Now here's the Coral Sea funny business happening, and you can see it here pushing westwards and creating some very heavy rainfall. Now the next 4 days after that, we're going to see quite a big split in the guidance. Now there is a huge split in where this rainfall will occur. So if it becomes a tropical cyclone, we're going to see rainfall very much centralised. So it's not going to be as widespread as you're seeing here on your screens. If it becomes a tropical cyclone and adopts scenario 1 and pushes southwards, depending on how close to the coast it gets, if it gets very close to the coast, we're going to see very heavy rainfalls, 400 plus millimetres of rain to the south of it. This model will underestimate that because it's hedging its bets on either scenario 1 or scenario 2. It's not sure which one's going to happen, so it's hedging its bets either way. So if scenario 1 happens, you're going to see extreme rainfall amounts to the south of the system. But, once again, the threat with scenario 1 is that it'll remain too far offshore and no one gets rain. And that's not a scenario we hope will come true. So if we do get scenario 1, we want the system to get either on the coast or very close to the coast. Scenario 2, the system tracking across the peninsula, that is a much more widespread rainfall producer. And we will see those 100 plus millimetre falls all along the coastline, as I said, well north of Rocky, but all the way through to Cape Melville, with the threat of isolated, more significant falls. But you won't see those massive destructive 500 plus millimetre falls that you will if scenario 1 comes through. Over the Joseph Bonaparte Gulf, we see that low continuing to track westwards. Here it is here in the Timor/Southern Indian Ocean, and we will then probably see that low start to drift in a more southwesterly direction once it's over there, and that's when it could start to deepen. So that's after day 7 though, so we're not going to talk too much about that. We've got our hands full too much over the next 7 days. We're going to see probably a re-increase of some shower and storm activity along the Northern Territory, the western top-end coast as well. So Darwin, you might see a return to that shower and storm activity, but not general rainfall as yet because we're still in monsoon break conditions and we're likely to remain in monsoon break conditions for a while. Alright folks, that's a lot to get through tonight. I'm sorry it took so long, but as I said, until the pattern becomes less complex, I just can't make these any shorter without explaining the possibilities. Thanks for watching. We'll talk again tomorrow night. Good night.